This is Donald J. Trump, President of the United States. Mark Thompson is a huge loser. His show, very bad, weak, soft. But if you're interested in crap and you're a communist, you can go to edge-show.com. I don't recommend it.
You're listening to The Edge with Mark Thompson.
Hi, it's Mark. Thanks for being here. Jimmy Dore for the entire episode. Jimmy is a one-man wrecking crew when it comes to politics, the economy, a gamed system, and insights about the future. We'll ask him about all those things. Thanks for all the ways you support this show, 5-star reviews, any nice words. If you're going to shop on Amazon anyway, go to our website, edge-show.com, and click on any place that says Amazon. It's the same Amazon as usual. We get a little spin-off of what you... We're not saying you have to shop Amazon, but if you're going to anyway, it's a way to support us. Otherwise, I don't ask for money in these times of really a tough economy. Just want you to keep your money for you. But Jimmy Dore is so good, and I will just try to get out of his way as best I can and let him do his thing. Let's get started.
This is The Edge.
The advantage it means.
They let guy just spit on me for no reason.
That's horrible.
Is there some comfort in uncertainty, do you think?
You're a degenerate.
Because Australian Shepherds need action.
Wow. Yeah.
This is The Edge.
That's a self-loathing term that I use.
Oh, got it.
Hey, Mark, how you doing? Is this on the radio?
No, this is on the podcast, so you can say whatever you want with the F word.
Oh,
you can
okay,
also fly a little bit more here on the...
Okay, good. I didn't know. I don't know if I could swear or not. All right.
Yeah, you're totally okay swearing. So, no, that's your thing. You don't want to hold back that bilious rage, God damn it.
It's the language of the working class, Mark.
Oh, that's right. I forgot. Sorry. Yeah. You know, I've been so out of touch with the working class for so long that it's...
I know.
Me,
well, I know. Working class doesn't have to worry about fire danger.
Right, exactly. Because the society's on fire. It's all around them.
That's
second.
right, baby.
Yeah, you know.
Let's not waste this.
Yeah. Are you rolling, Albert?
I'm rolling right now, so I can check the list.
Oh, no. Did you hear any of what we just said or not, Albert?
About the working class? I recorded and heard it.
Oh, okay.
It's indeed a pleasure. He is, you know, the thing about the new world is that there are influencers, there are tastemakers, there are people who many people look to for truths that they don't get in a lot of other places. Such a person is with us in this episode. And he is one of the top, and it sounds like I'm saying this facetiously, but I'm actually being serious. He is a guy with an immense following, and he's Jimmy Dore. Jimmy, you are you at your side hustle? Are you working in a kitchen or a restaurant or something? What are you doing right now? I'm hearing pots and pans, and you're making lunch?
We do. I do a small breakfast service every morning, and it's a fluffy egg sandwich on whole grain with an espresso and a sparkling water, and it's a very limited menu. It's like a food truck, but it's my specialty. Yeah, and I like to serve food. I mean,
you like to knock around the kitchen. I know this COVID-19 thing has probably really cut down on that a lot.
I'm making a coffee right now. Sorry, I didn't mean to make too much noise. I'm sorry.
No, it's great. It's great. I love it.
I have an espresso machine, and so I'm making an espresso.
Did you buy that espresso machine with all that YouTube money, or now that you're a tastemaker?
You know, I'm in the pocket of Big Piece, and. I was actually accused of that. I was actually accused of my view on Syria was because I took $2,500 from a peace organization. I was like, you got it.
Is that right?
Yeah, that was written by some garbage website it's funded by the NED, the National Endowment for Democracy, which means it's our own government. And so they put out propaganda, and I got caught up in their web. I'm one of the people who was telling the counter narrative to the Syria propaganda, and so that landed me on their radar. And so they tried to discredit me by saying, oh, yeah, Jimmy Dore says this about Syria and the gas attacks, because he's being funded by these people who are Assad apologists. It's actually a peace organization. So I don't know. Is this boring? But that's actually happened to me.
Yeah, the gas attacks, as everybody, just to kind of get people caught up. I mean, remember, one of the big things about Assad was pointed to is he was gassing his own people, and Jimmy was calling out the fact that that actually didn't happen.
Well, because I don't know if I'm old, and I'm probably a little older than you, Mark. I lived through something called the Iraq War 1 and 2. And those things
I've heard
were
about
complete fabrications. The first one, they said Iraqi soldiers were going into Kuwait and taking babies out of incubators and throwing them on the ground. That was complete fabrication that was made up by a PR organization. And the people who testified was the daughter of the ambassador to Kuwait, and they didn't say that's who it was. She totally made it up. So that's just one way by the way, after that testimony was shown on the news, the public opinion for the first Gulf War went from negative numbers to positive numbers, and that's exactly what they needed. And then we launched the invasion. And so the second time, it was WMDs, right, that ended up on the front page of the New York Times uncritically from, for some reason, Judith Miller. I've never explained to me why she wasn't edited at the New York Times, and why the stuff that came out of Dick Cheney's mouth was allowed to go right on, uncritically put on the front page of the New York Times. And so that was the scam, right? So Dick Cheney would say the stuff to Judith Miller, and then she would put it in the front page of the New York Times uncritically, and then he would go on Meet the Press and go, look, the New York Times even says so. So do you see how that kind of game works? Anyway, so when Syria
this is important. This is important what you're saying, I think, because it is still going on in such a big way that the media works hand in glove with government oftentimes in terms of getting propaganda out. Sometimes it's deliberate, and sometimes they're just unwitting participants in it.
Yeah, and then they also hold back, like the revelations of the CIA warrantless wiretapping. They wouldn't release that in their newspaper until after the election. So it's stuff like that, right? So they're definitely a propaganda. So when Libya happened, I was skeptical, and of course it turned out to be the exact same thing. We wanted to go in there and overturn a successful country and turn it into a failed state with open slave markets. And what did we do? We funded terrorists to do it. And those same terrorists we funded. So then when they wanted to go into Syria and bomb them, I was a part of the Young Turks by that point. And I was I think I was the lone voice saying me and Steve O saying, no, this is the exact same garbage as Libya and Iraq. And so we were right. And when they said there was a gas attack, I'm like, why? That doesn't make any sense that he would do this. The one thing that would draw the United States into this conflict is a gas attack. And he would do that one thing. It didn't make any sense. And then I found videotape and I found news reports of the United States wanting to overthrow Assad in 2006. Christina Amanpour, when she worked for CNN, interviewed Assad in 2006 and said, there's a lot of regime change talk happening right now. Well, the reason why they said the regime change was happening this time was because of the Arab Spring. So, of course, it was garbage. They've been wanting to overthrow them forever. There's lots of reasons. One of them is they want to put a pipeline through Syria. So that's one of the reasons. That's why Russia sides with Syria, because that pipeline would cut into Russians selling natural gas to Europe. So that it all comes down to fossil fuels and natural resources. And so I was onto that as soon as the mainstream media started to broadcast the propaganda about gas attacks and Assad. I found actual journalists on the ground like Robert Fisk, who's award-winning, who said there's no evidence of any of this. This is all just being made up. And then, of course, you had the phony reports from the OPCW. And then there was the 4 whistleblowers because the report was manipulated. They left out the critical findings from the engineers that said that those gas attacks didn't happen and that those gas attack bombshells were placed there manually. So, again, this was propaganda to start a war. And so I was on it. And so the government funds a website called Bellingcat through the NED, National Endowment for Democracy, which is where they just want to overthrow stuff. And then they put me in their crosshairs and say, this guy's in the pocket of a pro-Assad regime. No, it was a peace organization donated $2,500 to us because we were telling the truth and we were anti-interventionists in Syria. So that's where all that came from. That's when I joke. That's how easy it is to become an influencer, Mark, is all you have to do is not believe what you hear on the news about war.
No, it's true that the march to war is led by so much propaganda that's completely concocted. And I have to, go ahead.
No, it's your show. I'm sorry.
No, it's great. I mean, you know, one of the great things, I saw you with, I feel like Matt Taibbi or one of those guys. And, you know, you do lay bare a lot of these narratives. But I thought the other thing, just in relation to like interrupting each other, getting out of your way, I was struck by, you just roared. It was like a one-man show for 30 minutes. It was great. You just saw Taibbi lean back and you don't have to help Jimmy Dore along at all. I mean, I can remark on it sort of in this fun way, but it is true. I feel as though you have the courage of your conviction. It's not just a show. I mean, I think you're angered by this stuff, and those who've seen Jimmy in person, I mean, you know that it's a real thing. I mean, this is not just, you just haven't found a gold vein of performance. I think you care passionately about the stuff you talk about.
Yeah, I mean, I always did. It started as a young age. Well, I took a class in St. Lawrence High School, and it was taught by Mr. Andrela. It was called Current Events, and our textbook was Time Magazine. So we had to read Time Magazine. Now, that's before the Telecommunications Act of 1996, brought to you by Bill Clinton and the Democrats, which took us from 50 giant media organizations in the United States down to 6. Which is why the country's in the shape it's in right now.
That was something that even at the time that I was making noise about. I mean, there was no YouTube platform that was worth anything for me. I just had to do it kind of in interviews and that sort of thing. But it, to me, was a clear abomination that was going to lead to sort of this mergeopoly that's happened. And you have 3 or 4 news organizations run by 3 or 4 corporations. Yeah,
I mean, that's my and that was brought to you by the Democrats. That's the new Democrats, the DLC, Democratic Leadership Councils, founded by Bill Clinton, Al Gore, and who else? The Koch brothers. And people don't know that. And so they don't really – so that's what people keep going, wait a minute, we voted for Barack Obama – and he made the banks bigger. He took us from 2 wars to 7. He made the Bush tax cuts permanent. He gave us a right-wing health care plan anyway without a public option. He opened the Arctic to drilling twice whenever Shell Oil asked. He let the cops crack the head of peaceful protesters that occupy Wall Street from coast to coast. He let it play out at DAFL. I mean, that's why there's fracking pipes underneath this country, because he repealed the prohibition against exporting fossil fuel. I mean, it is so people sit there wonder why is the country in the position it's in. It's because people like Barack Obama and Bill Clinton know how to pay fealty to democracy, but they're actually corporatists, right? They stopped being Democrats after Ronald Reagan scared the hell out of them so much. They decided if you can't beat them, join them. And so then they got in bed with Wall Street, the military-industrial complex, big pharma, health insurance companies, and now you wonder why we have Donald Trump. So after 30, 40 years of that, we got Donald Trump. And that's what I was trying to scream about in the last election, which caught me a lot of heat. I'm saying we have to stop doing this. Hillary Clinton is not the answer. And by the way, if we do get elected Hillary Clinton, we're going to get a worse Trump. And, you know, what's happening right now in the streets should have happened a long time ago. But we had a black guy with a Muslim name as our president, and we thought he was on our side. And he wasn't on our side. Barack Obama was the guy who militarized our police forces, right? Barack Obama had a black guy and headed the criminal justice system, didn't put one banker in jail, didn't put one person who ordered a torture program, international torture program revealed, didn't prosecute, not even a hearing. So and then you wonder why we're in this. So that's kind of the groove of my show, is to expose the lies of the media about war and everything else, and that the fact that we don't have a two-party system. Nancy Pelosi does, in fact, not oppose Donald Trump. When she was ripping up his speech at the State of the Union, she was busily that very week passing his entire legislative agenda, including money for a border wall. So, in fact, it's so funny. I've talked to you about this. It's so easy for Donald Trump. He accidentally outlefts the Democrats all the time. For instance, he did it with the CARES Act. So when everybody gets the coronavirus, he goes, oh, by the way, if you get coronavirus and you don't have insurance, don't worry about it. Just go to the thing. We're going to pay for it. No out-of-pockets, no co-pays, and no after-billing. Until you're well, the hospital will take care of you, and the government's going to pay them through the Medicare system. The Democrats didn't propose that. Donald goddamn Trump did. Donald Trump and it was Larry Kudlow and Mitt Romney wanted to have direct cash payments of UBI to people during the coronavirus. It was Nancy Pelosi who stopped it, wanted to means that. So my point is that there is no two-party system. We have 100% corrupt oligarchy, and it's not only just an oligarchy, it's a rapacious oligarchy, meaning what happened during this coronavirus thing is that our economy was purposely shut down, meaning the government took the gas out of the car, right? So if our economy, this is how Dylan Radigan explained it on my show, if our economy is a car and it ran out of gas on the highway, well, it's not Democrat, Republican, left, right, or libertarian. You go put gas in the car. It's just common sense. But instead, what the Congress did, along with the Trump administration, Nancy Pelosi and Mitch McConnell, what they did, instead of putting gas in that car, was they put it up on blocks, took the tires off it, and ripped the radio out, and then left. And that's where we still are right now. By the way, we're in the middle of a Great Depression, and which was caused by our government, and it didn't have to happen because that's why they're a rapacious oligarchy. What's the first thing you do in a pandemic? You give people health care. In a pandemic, that'd be the first thing you do. Now, when 40 million people lose their jobs and lose their health care, what do? You give them health care. They're not fucking doing that. By the way, Germany is handling this way better right now. You know what the unemployment rate is in Germany? 6%. Why? Because they did it correctly. And there's a way to do it. I won't go into the weeds on it, but they did it totally different than us. And why do you think there would have been people in every city in America protesting if they would have just received their third $2,000 check and Medicare? No, they would have felt like their government was taking care of them a little bit, and the normal chains of influence actually did work. But because that didn't happen, and it's obvious the government doesn't give a shit about them, and in fact is rapacious in their fucking legislation. So what we usually do to other people overseas, David Feldman used to always say this on my show, we're going to eventually do to ourselves. We put the military in the streets of Baghdad, and we fucking have mercenaries shooting people. We're eventually going to do that to us. That is exactly what is happening, and we're doing it to us, except we have to send the Marines in to knock over their government and then install a puppet. We don't have to send in the Marines to the United States because the government's already been knocked over by our corporations that want to steal our natural resources anyway. And as soon as the coronavirus pandemic hit, they had a plan in place to fix what? To fix the citizenry and our economy? No, to rape the treasury of $5 trillion in the greatest upward transfer of wealth in the history of humankind. And they got Bernie Sanders and AOC and the squad to vote for it. That's the genius of their evil.
Yeah, I call it the greatest looting of the American treasury in history. You point to something that's interesting, which is that it got the support of progressives that you don't associate with this.
Yeah, and the reason why that happened is because we have a two-party system. And the Democrats, if you've noticed through all of this, no matter how loud AOC screams against the CARES Act, she votes for it and then doesn't say one word about her own leadership, which is actually crafting the bill, which is Nancy Pelosi. Nancy Pelosi and the Democrats rule the House. What was the point of taking over the House if they're not going to pass Medicare for all anyway, if they're not going to pass a UBI bill anyway, if they're going to actually craft a bill and then vote for it unanimously, the greatest upward transfer of wealth in the human history, there's no point to vote for Democrats, including Justice Democrats, including people who you think are progressives. The Democratic Party in the House, after they took over the House, this might be newsflash to everybody, they moved to the right. They didn't move to the left. Nancy Pelosi moved to the right. They didn't move to the left. The progressives have zero influence, and the only influence they have is to call them out, and they will never speak negatively against the Democratic leadership. AOC, they calls Nancy Pelosi Mama Bear. Well, Mama Bear just screwed the entire country, and she didn't let you oppose her. Nick, when she was screaming AOC on the floor during the CARES Act, and she was saying there's crumbs in this bill, she was right, but she didn't say, and the Democrats crafted this, and shame on them, and we should be passing our own bill that actually takes care of people, and then let the Republicans veto it in the Senate or Trump veto it, and then we can run on that. That's how you're supposed to run a that's how you're supposed to do politics. That's how you're supposed to legislate. And what they were supposed to do, people go, well, what was Bernie Sanders supposed to do, Jimmy? He's just one guy. Well, I don't know if you know, but one senator can stop a bill for weeks, and they do it all the time. Rand Paul does it all the goddamn time. That's why he's such a thorn in the side. And so what Bernie Sanders was supposed to do was say, hey, they're getting ready to screw everybody. I'm putting a hold on this bill, and I'm going to try and get some kind of a progressive coalition. The people who were in progressive NGOs didn't even know it was in the CARES Act. They were trying to, and then they all go home and they say what was in the CARES Act was good because we got you $600 in unemployment benefits. Well, if that's such a great deal, why was AOC saying it was crumbs? Because it is crumbs. They just, by the way, people have no idea the transformation of not only our economy, but our culture that's coming out of this. There's going to be permanent long-term unemployment.
Oh, there's no question about it. Yeah, businesses are going to go away. Yeah.
And the day it happened, I was the one screaming, why isn't Bernie Sanders doing anything? And everybody was saying, no, Bernie did. He gave a speech and he got unemployment. That was theater. That he didn't do that. That was all made up. But Bernie Sanders said on an email.
I understand what you're saying. The rhetoric of change is there, but there is no real legislative push for change. And is that motivated by what? Power? Give me the motivation behind that.
So right now, this situation, if you were Bernie Sanders or a progressive, you would be like, did the Lord Jesus Christ himself invent this situation for us? Because guess who's got all the solutions right now? What is needed right now is Medicare for all and a UBI. When this happened, this pandemic happened, Dylan Ratigan came out and said that they're going to have to do this. And I go, why would they do this? He goes, they're out of options, Jimmy. They have to do it. Well, turns out they were more evil and rapacious than even we thought. Right? Even we thought they were even worse. So why? That's why. I mean,
there was a push for UBI initially, right? I mean, as you suggested, I think even in this conversation, yeah.
And Nancy Pelosi stopped it. So there was a study in Princeton, and they concluded that we don't live in a democracy, we live in an oligarchy. And what does that mean? Well, they figured out that the views of the 80% of bottom earners in America never have any impact whatsoever on legislation. But the upper 10% does. Like, for instance, if 50% of the upper 10% of the wealthy in America want something to happen legislatively, 50% of the time it'll happen. So there's a correlation between the wealthy, the upper 10%'s desires, and it's being reflected in legislation. There is no correlation with the bottom 80%. And so the conclusion was we live in an oligarchy. Well, this is the result of it. Why don't we have health care? It's ridiculous. It's ridiculous. It saves money, and they still won't give it to us. Why? Because there's a criminal class of people who are called skimmers. That's Blue Cross, Blue Shield, Anthem. They're skimmers, right? So what they do is they make their money off of inflicting pain on America. They don't provide a service. They skim and deny you service. Because if we wanted to provide people health care, instead of giving a third of the money we spend on it to a skimmer, we would just give it to the people delivering the health care. They have nothing to do with health care. And it's crazy that we still have this system in America. And everybody knows it now. As everybody's losing their job and they're losing their health care, it's great. And what's the Democrat solution to this? Well, if you're an oligarch, your solution is to pay everyone's COBRA. So instead of taking the government money and giving it to the doctor when the citizen needs the treatment, you take the money, you give it to a third party, and then he decides when to give it to the citizen. That was
always my problem with Obamacare was it's just an insurance company grab. I mean, and that was the best you could do in this country at the time in terms of making a deal because, as Jimmy is saying, unless you're going to go with a socialized health care program, you're going to end up, if you have to sit down with insurance companies, and they are huge lobbies, they may be one of the biggest lobbies in Washington, you're not going to get anything passed without them because they own the politicians.
And that's why I laid out what happened with Bill Clinton and Al Gore and the Democratic leadership. That's where this all comes from. That's when the Democratic Party decided to stop being the party that represented workers and started to be the party that represented Wall Street, the military-industrial complex, big pharma, and the fossil fuel industry. And that's the fact. I mean, the DNC, they made a big thing that they got them to stop taking fossil fuel money. They voted and they stopped taking fossil fuel money at the DNC, and then they just reversed the decision. No, turns out we're going to do that. No, it turns out we're corrupt. And so your previous question was, why does Bernie Sanders and the squad, why did they go along with this CARES Act, which was and why do they call it the CARES Act? Well, as Dylan Ragland said, because they can't call it, hey, we're taking all the money away from you again. Act. That's why they can't. because they did this in 2008, right? So when the first crash happened, they, instead of doing rational things and hey, this doesn't work, just to be selling debt constantly, and then side bets on debt and insurance on side bets of debt, this actually doesn't work for an economy. So let's get back to investing. And they didn't. What they did was they set in motion a process that was on a tripwire. So when we had another crisis, they were able to fleece us within a week or two instead of what took it months in 2008, from when they got the TARP and all that stuff and the $15 trillion and the unlimited fund. Well, they had it. Now it's just on a tripwire. Now the Fed says, don't worry, $1 trillion a day if you need it. No matter how much money they need, that's why as 40 million people are unemployed, you can see the stock market go up.
That's right. And we covered this in the last episode with David Dayen, who talked about, he laid bare all of these benefits that are associated with junk bond purchases on the part of taxpayers. And, there were tax breaks within the CARES Act that, just didn't get any visibility whatsoever because, as Jimmy said, it almost happened under cover of night. I want to go back because of this, because you mentioned Pelosi and the squad. There was a sense that was played out in the media. I mean, I think you're going to challenge this narrative. And that was, hey, we don't want to be seen as holding up money that's going to average Americans. So that's why we can't demand that these bills have in them a lot of the stuff that will make it to Main Street. And we kind of have to play along with the controlling party at the executive level and in the Senate.
That's why I voted for the Holocaust camps, because I would have got bad press if I was against it.
Right.
Your rationale is that you would have got bad press because you would have stood up against the largest transfer of wealth in the history of human fucking kind and demanded a UBI and Medicare for all for your vote. The least you could have did was vote against it and tell people why, because now we're going to have to live through it. But why didn't they do it? Because they're politicians. And let's remember, politics always attracts the most mediocre of people. So no matter how much you love Bernie Sanders, he still lacks a lot of things. And one of them is the courage to go against the Democratic Party. He's not an independent. He's one of them. He's part of the fucking leadership. And what is his leadership supposed to do? He's in charge of recruitment. Right? And so that means he's supposed to sheep herd progressives in the Democratic Party, and then they can squash them. So what I was saying before was that the Democrats, right now, this situation was built for Bernie Sanders. And what is he doing? Instead of going around and forcing one of the presidential candidates to adopt Medicare for all, he's telling everybody to vote for the guy who's promised to veto Medicare for all. It's the exact opposite of what he should be doing. It's the exact opposite of what someone who's in charge of a movement should be doing. You should be leveraging that movement against the Democratic Party to extract concessions. He's not doing any of that. In fact, he's lying to people by telling them that Joe Biden is the answer to our problems and Donald Trump instead of the cause of our problems and Donald Trump, because he is. That's why people were so desperate to vote for Donald Trump in the first place. Why didn't black people in Milwaukee vote for Hillary Clinton? Well, the New York Times will tell you. They went and interviewed people in barbershops, people who voted for Barack Obama twice, and said our lives got worse. Why? Because they did. And then I talked to a Waffle House cook in Virginia, and he'll tell me, he goes, hey, we all knew Donald Trump was a loudmouthed Yankee who should have had his ass kicked a long time ago, but we're desperate. And these people, he was at least promising us something. Hillary Clinton promised us nothing. And so people are in such a desperate situation. This is called a failed system. What I try to tell people is, what do you call a system that takes the richest country the face of the earth has ever seen and renders half of its population poor or low income, 80% of workers live paycheck to paycheck, 30 per million people with no health care, 80 million people underinsured? You call that a failed system. That's what we're living under. And instead of Bernie Sanders and the squad screaming about we need to change this fucking system and this pandemic is the perfect time for it and calling for general strikes because guess who's got all the power in this economy? Turns out it's essential workers. And instead of them doing that, they're going along with Nancy Pelosi's agenda and sending me fundraising emails for charity. Fuck you. Fuck you. You are part of the machine now. They are working against you now. You have no representation in Congress, which is why people are in the fucking street. And the people in the Justice Democrats and Bernie Sanders are capitulators and phonies, and don't ever expect them to stand up for you when it counts, because they're not. And if they would have been, we would have actually had they would have stopped the CARES Act, and they would have made everybody aware of what was happening, and they would have stood up to it. And they give us some fucking pansy-ass excuse that I would have got bad press, I would have been seen as holding up something. You should have been fucking seen as demanding that Nancy Pelosi put a UBI and Medicare for all in that fucking $5 trillion bill. But they didn't. In fact, not only did they not vote against it, they voted fucking for it. And then AOC lies weeks later and said she voted against it, which is a lie.
Jimmy, do you see the two parties? You said that, it's not a two-party system, it's a one-party system. And I get the ways in which that's true. But do you see a difference between the parties? Surely there must be. I share the let me just say this quickly, and then I'll let you speak. But I share your sentiment that this is a ridiculously unworkable and corporatized system, and it's an oligarchy without question. And I would even throw, because this is sort of my pet issue, environment, I'd throw in the fact that, capitalism, which needs to show growth on the bottom line every year, will sort of by definition suck up all the resources in the world. I mean, if you want growth year after year after year, unless you have some sustainability built into your plan, you'll constantly be using more and more resources to the point that it's an unsustainable process, both economically and I'd suggest from the standpoint of natural resources. So I guess what I'm getting at is it the capitalist part of it that you have a problem with? Is it the two-party system that's not really a two-party system? And do you see any differences between the two parties?
So all of those things are part of the problem. Of course, Michael, the big point I took away from the latest Michael Moore project about the planet Earth was that switching to green energy isn't enough. We have to reduce our consumption. And, when this pandemic happened, it showed what could happen. We can reduce our consumption and still live. So, and it's going to take a massive but that won't happen. I just don't, it's not happening. It's just not. Capitalism has control of the entire planet. And you're exactly right. So capitalism is working again. So we tried to make capitalism work. The green, we can do everything green, to the point where they're like, we can have a green military. What the fuck? And so I think that's kind of the lie of capitalism. And you're right. It's built on constant growth. Now, as far as a two-party system, we would be better off with a outwardly one-party system. We have an inherently one-party system. And when you say, well, are the Democrats a little bit better? Yes, outwardly, but actually, in effect, they're actually more evil. How so, Jimmy? Well, so people always say you have to vote for the Democrat because they're the lesser of two evil. Well, I like to ask people, was Bill Clinton the lesser of two evil, or was George Herbert Walker Bush the lesser of two evil? And they go, well, obviously Bill Clinton was. And I say, you're incorrect. Bill Clinton was not the lesser of two evil. If you've noticed, George Herbert Walker Bush could not pass NAFTA. Why? Because the Democrats were still kind of with the unions at that moment, and he couldn't get it passed. Well, Bill Clinton gets elected. He has a mandate. He gives cover to the Blue Dog Democrats to go along with NAFTA, and they finally get it passed. Then Bill Clinton goes on to gut welfare as he explodes the prison population while deregulating the media and Wall Street, including getting rid of Glass-Steagall, and he had a secret deal to privatize Social Security with Newt Gingrich, but that got squashed because Monica Lewinsky's blowjob came out the next day. So you think that George Herbert Walker Bush or Bob Dole would have been allowed to do all those things without considerable pushback from the left and screaming from the media? The answer is no. Just like when Barack Obama beat John McCain. Do you think in the middle of a depression, recession, an economic crash that we've never seen since the 20s, do you think that they would allow John McCain to make the banks bigger? Do you think they would allow John McCain to take us from 2 wars to 7? Do you think they would allow John McCain to make the Bush tax cuts permanent? Do you think they would allow John McCain to crack the heads of peaceful protesters of Trump country coast to coast during Occupy Wall Street? Do you think they would have let John McCain put fracking pipes underneath this country? It might have happened, but there would have been hell to pay, and there would have been a pushback. You got none of that when Barack Obama was president. Barack Obama's president, you think that's all we can get? If a black guy with a Muslim name says that's all we can get, then that's all we can get. And boy, he was charming. So what we got was an ass fucking by a guy who was charming instead of an ass fucking by a guy who's grotesque, which is Donald Trump. But guess what? People see the ass fucking from Donald Trump, and they got in the streets. And now there's police reform happening coast to coast. This reminds me of a time when Richard Nixon was president, and we got the Clean Water Act. We got the Clean Air Act. Richard Nixon gave us OSHA. Richard Nixon gave us the EPA. Was that because he was an environmentalist? Or was that because everybody could see he was a fucking wolf in wolf's clothing? instead of what the Democrats are wolves in sheep's clothing. Everybody can see. I want the motherfucker I can see coming. I want that guy because I can oppose that motherfucker.
I want to ask you, in the time we have remaining, to talk about the election. You've spoken in broad terms, and you've mentioned Joe Biden along the way in the context of some of the stuff you've touched on. I want to speak to something that you talk about a lot. I'm going to suggest it's rhetoric that has really, when calling it rhetoric, I don't mean it in a put-down way. I mean it as like your words have really caught fire. And those are in relation to Joe Biden's state of mind. You know, you talk about his dementia and this kind of thing. And I've heard it repeated from others. I wonder if you could give us a second on that, because I guess while I see a diminished guy in Joe Biden, again, this is a separate issue from the politics. It's a separate issue from the one-party system, from the plutocracy, from all of this stuff. I'm just talking about the guy's, soundness of mind. I wonder if you could speak to that. Haven't you said stuff like that? Like he's a guy who's completely dealing with dementia, right?
So it's obvious that in the nicest terms, you said Joe is suffering from early onset mental decline. The way normal people talk is he's demented. He's obvious that he's demented. And it's almost elder abuse to have this guy. The guy he stumbles on a commercial. They play a commercial on my show for Joe Biden. He stumbles twice in the commercial. You can edit that. You can do it again. You can pre-record it. The guy, it's obvious to everyone, right?
Well, he was a stutterer. You don't mean that, right? He was a stutterer years ago. I don't know. As you get older, maybe you fall down again on that.
Yeah. No. Well, again, they told you to ignore the evidence of your eyes and ears. It was their final and most important command.
Yeah, I hear you.
And
Okay.
That's from George Orwell. Because if you're going to sit here and argue that Joe Biden isn't demented, then I'm not going to argue that. It's obvious to me. And if you're not, then you're the world's worst detective, I guess. But and why is it, by the way, I never get castigated for saying this. Why is it now you're allowed to comment on the health of Donald Trump? Donald Trump, people has been saying he was demented since the day he got into the presidency. The Young Turks used to do videos. Trump is demented. And I'm like, well, I thought you couldn't do that because when Hillary was running, you couldn't say anything about her health, or you were considered a right-wing crazy. But, of course, I'm old enough to remember that we're always allowed to speculate on the health of politicians. We're always allowed to, except that one time. Wasn't that weird? It's almost like what Chomsky said, how the liberal class is there to set the parameters of debate. And they were like, no, it's not okay this time that you can't speculate on Hillary's health. That was the craziest fucking thing I ever saw in my life. And everybody went along with it, just like everybody went along with Russiagate. So it just goes to show you that most people have the herd mentality, including journalism, which is why journalism is almost worthless in the United States.
Certainly, broadcast journalism and a lot of print journalism has become that. But I also feel as though there is really legitimate investigative work being done. And I also would suggest that those things that were happening at the edges, you have been part of that. These movements of investigation that have occurred outside sort of the mainstream, they've been revealing,
Yeah. Well, what does it tell you when the Democrats say Donald Trump is working for a foreign power? He's a traitor to our country. He's the most corrupt person in the history ever, and the most dangerous, corrupt, and all that. And by the way, what do you think we give him an extra $131 billion to go bomb the fuck out anybody he wants? Does that make sense to you?
Right. You're saying the rhetoric of the Democrats doesn't match the legislative record of the Democrats.
100%. That's what I'm saying. I'm saying the Democrats, they're all the same. They're not opposing Donald Trump. If you think Nancy Pelosi is opposing Donald Trump, now who's being naive? It is professional wrestling. They all work for the same guy. Nancy Pelosi is a 100 millionaire. Would she be? And then she's the leader of the People's Party? Are you shitting me? That there is no People's Party. That's why people are in the street, Mark. And it's not just black people. It's all kind of people. And there will be more social unrest.
There's a complete disenfranchisement economically going on in America. There's no question about that. What would be the way you'd dig your way out of this? You think that, it sounds as though, based on everything you've said, that you would have to look toward a revolution.
Well, it's kind of happening. And if it doesn't happen, we'll become Brazil, because that's where we're on the, we're basically a third world country.
In waiting.
My point, other people have said this, that's and it's masked by Silicon Valley, Los Angeles, Chicago, and Wall Street. Other than that, we're pretty much a third world country where people don't have infrastructure. They get lead in their water. They don't have health care. Schools are crumbling. Everybody's in debt. This is a third world country. And So the thing that's keeping us afloat right now, this rapacious oligarchy, is that we have the ability to print our own money. We have the sovereign currency, but also that we're the default currency of the world because of the petrodollar, which is another thing they'll never talk about on the news. Why are we in Yemen? The petrodollar. Why are we friends with Saudi Arabia? The petrodollar. Why are we in Syria? The petrodollar. Why are we in Africa? The petrodollar. Why are we doing all this shit? The petrodollar. Why did Trump turn the other way when Saudi Arabia killed that journalist? The petrodollar. Why did Barack Obama have to fly to Saudi Arabia after the Congress passed a law saying you could sue Saudi Arabia for 9/11 because of the petrodollar? And he had to smooth everything over. I'm sure people at home are going, what the hell is that, Jimmy? And why isn't it ever talked about on the news? Again, it's like when you say, Mark, there's a lot of great journalism happening in journalism in America. And there is. There are always good stories. I read the news. But what you're not going to see is the structural, critiques necessary to open people's eyes. Like, why is all this happening?
Well, that's what I saw Iran, the march up to Iran, when there were huge Iran tensions early in this administration, and we pulled out of the Iran nuclear deal, but then it was followed by this sort of militaristic posture toward Iran. I remember saying on the air, this is about the petrodollar, because this is something that America clings to. Can you just give us a minute and 30 on that? Go ahead.
So very quickly, when we went off the gold standard, we made a deal with Saudi Arabia that whenever someone would buy oil from Saudi Arabia, they would have to give them U.S. dollars. They would have to do it in U.S. dollars. And so then they would take lots of those U.S. dollars and buy our treasuries. But so that keeps the American currency, like 77% of all assets in the world are monetized and valued in the U.S. dollars. So that's why our U.S. dollar is the reserve currency of note of the world, right, which is a big deal. And so that has tied into that petrodollar. For everybody who has to buy oil, they have to convert their currency into U.S. dollars. And why would they do that? Why would Saudi Arabia go along with that? Why would they help us that way? Because we promised them the use of our military. And that's why we went into Iraq. And that's why we're in Yemen. And that's why we're going to Syria. And that's why and by the way, John, this isn't a theory. John Kerry, when he was Secretary of State, and I played this video on my show many times, was asked directly about how much it would cost for us to go into Syria. And he said, our Arab friends, that's what he said, our Arab friends have pledged that they will pay for it 100% as much as it will cost, like they've done in the past. That was the direct quote from John Kerry. And so that's him admitting that's kind of a gaffe. And what is a gaffe is when you accidentally tell the truth in Washington. That's a gaffe. And that's what that was. And I got it on my show. But again, that's something you'll never see. So when the Iran thing happens, who do they get on as an expert? Well, CBS News will call the retired former admiral from the Mediterranean, who now is on the board of Raytheon. And they don't tell you he's on the board of Raytheon. They tell you he's the former commander in the Mediterranean for the Navy, but they don't tell you now he works for an armed weapons manufacturer. He's on the board, and they're all fucking millionaires now, and he's going to advocate for more war. And that's one thing I wanted to tell you before about, Brian Williams. This just shows you the rotten side, the news media. So Brian Williams has gotten in big trouble because he puffed up his war record like everybody does, right? He says that he took enemy fire on a helicopter and it didn't happen, and NBC News threw him under the bus, and then he said that bus took rocket fire. But anyway, that's the joke part. But the real part is...
I like that joke, actually.
Thank you. But then that was the scandal that got him fired or temporarily suspended or whatever. But the real scandal was that all throughout the Iraq War, people would turn on Brian Williams' news because they trusted him to get the straight dope about what was happening in Iraq so they could make a decision as an informed electorate in a democracy, right? And Brian Williams would bring on all these experts to tell you what was happening there and what we should be doing in Iraq. But what Brian Williams didn't tell you is that every one of those experts was being paid by a weapons manufacturer, not only to advocate for more war, but in many instances to advocate for a certain type of war that involved a weapon that weapons manufacturer that was paying that expert manufactured. And that story was told to you not by NBC News. That story was broken by a reporter in the New York Times who won the Pulitzer Prize, telling you that story about Brian Williams' corruption. After that story broke, Brian Williams and NBC News still didn't tell you that those people were being paid by arms manufacturers. To me, that's the real scandal, because we turn on NBC News and tell us what's happening, and what we're getting is a guy right from Raytheon advocating for a certain missile in certain instances, or a certain tank or a certain weapon, saying this is what's needed right now. And it's 100% propaganda. And that's, of course, not the part he gets in trouble for, because those are the people that pay the bills over at NBC News. It's the big it's fossil fuel, it's weapons manufacturers, it's health insurance and pharmaceuticals. And that's why this country's screwed right now. It's because we turned to the media. And how did the media get that corrupt? Well, Bill Clinton passed the Telecommunications Act in 1996. So you see how this all works. I hope everybody sees how this all works, and there isn't. And Dave Dayen told you about the CARES Act. Well, why didn't the Democrats stand up against the CARES Act? If he told you all the screwing that they actually – Nancy Pelosi's the leader. She's the fucking person in control. Why didn't she do something? It's because she's just as bad as Mitch McConnell. They're not working for you. They're working against you. Your government is working against you, and that's why people are in the streets. And people know it now. We're the richest country in the world, and people have to half their medicine. 46,000 people die every year. 600,000 people go into bankruptcy. GoFundMe is the biggest healthcare plan in this time. It's ridiculous. We are living in a failed state right now, and people don't know it, but I guess they do, and that's why they're in the streets. Finally, after 10 days, Bill de Blasio was like, well, maybe we should spend some money on social services instead of more cop guns. Maybe after it took 10 days for a guy who's supposed to be a fucking Democrat to finally say, maybe we should take some of that cop money and give it to the people.
Yeah, it's a grim picture. I'll let you go here in a second, but it's just interesting that you've folded so many pieces of the American economy and the American culture together. And I like that you've touched on these experts that we see, these talking heads who talk about so many things involved with military conflicts. And as you say, they have huge ties to weapons manufacturers. Well, the Secretary of Defense right now, Mark Esper, is a former, I think he works at Raytheon CEO, or if not Raytheon, one of those big ones.
You are correct.
Yeah.
You are correct.
So, and so that's who you have shaping policy. I mean, it's not unlike what's happening at the EPA, where you have coal lobbyists running the entire organization, and they're essentially defanging and ruining, in my view, any kind of even modest protections that were in place on the environment. So it's a grim picture. But more to the point, I mean, if you can't put food on the table, which is what you're sort of suggesting economically is happening, I think you have to really look at a sea change in politics and in the culture. And I suspect that is what's happening in America on some level. But I will say one last thing, and then I will let you speak, Jimmy. The last thing I would say is, as you pointed to Brazil, that is the risk you run whenever you look at civil unrest. You run the risk of a strongman rising and some kind of policy on the part of government that will maintain or bring back law and order. And people are so desperate. And when I say people, I mean business owners and probably, the moneyed class first. But also as people see, people are really getting hurt. You can't have a revolution without people getting killed, without blood being shed. There are very few of these peaceful revolutions. Those situations oftentimes make way for strongmen to rise.
Yeah, that's the risk of the oligarchs not giving people health care, education, and a decent wage. Isn't that amazing? The richest country in the world. All they have to do. I mean, it took FDR the last time. I mean, remember FDR told people he came from the wealthy class. He came from the privileged, and he told his friend, hey, if you don't give – because this is right after the Russian Revolution, and he saw what was coming. And he said, hey, if you don't give people some of our money, they're going to come and take all of your money. And so what did he do? He gave a jobs program. And you want a job? You got one. Okay. Can you imagine if that was the case today? Hey, you need a good job. Well, government's going to we'll give you, and you're going to go. What's your job? Go fucking fixing up the country, making it better.
This would have been a great moment for that. It astounds me that yet two great moments would have existed for that to happen. One, the Trump presidency, if he had prioritized an infrastructure bill instead of prioritizing a tax cut. But as you know, he's just there taking orders and photo ops. And now, this moment in time where you could have people doing coronavirus testing, you could have them do contact tracing. I mean, you could employ tons of Americans right now.
Yeah, again, we're not a poor nation. We just don't. And right now there's a big Cold War starting with China. And I just want to leave you on this, that don't fall for it, right? Because as Jack Ma, who's the Jeff Bezos of Asia, Jack Ma runs Alibaba, which is the Amazon of Asia, and he was at a conference and he said, this is funny to me because, the Americans' problem is that they don't spread their wealth around correctly. They've spent, and he said, look at all the trillions of dollars they've spent in the war over just the last 10 years. They could have, if they would have just spread that around, they'd have a much better country. And he said, the people are upset at they say China has ruined their economy. He said this wasn't our system. This was American capitalists' idea to take their good jobs, turn them into shitty jobs, and send them over to China. That was their idea, and then they got a tax break to do it. China didn't invent that system. That was the American capitalists and our own government that invented that system. Again, it's rapacious oligarchy. They're looting the country. That's what I'm talking about. So now when we have a pandemic, we don't make medicine here anymore. We don't make masks here anymore. We don't make fucking ventilators. We don't do it. So we just outsource everything because capitalism lives on the margin, right? Capitalism always how many nurses can you run this emergency room with? 10? Try it with 9. Let's see if it works. There's never any redundancy, right? It always has to work right at the edges, always right at the margin. So when there's a problem or a catastrophe, capitalism can't fucking fix it. It can't come to the rescue. It fails, just like it failed here. And the government had to come in and start ordering people to make masks and do this and that. Well, if we had a functioning economy in the first place that wasn't cutting the legs out from underneath our own fucking workers constantly at the benefit of the oligarchs who took over both of our parties, then we wouldn't have to have a government do that. But we do now because we have 100% corporate captured government. And that's it. Again, you think voting for a Democrat is going to change it. They all just voted for the screwing of you. Every one of them. AOC, Rashid Tlaib, Ro Khanna, every fucking one of including Bernie Sanders. It passed 96-0 in the goddamn Senate. So anyway, it's worse than people think. The country is not going to snap back. It's going to be a long-term depression with long-term unemployment, and people need to get in the streets now to fucking make their leaders afraid of them. You know, in the book, Henry Kissinger has a book. Chris Hedges tells this story on my show, and at the end of the book, the protesters are at the gates of the White House, and they had to line up school buses in case they got through the gates so that the buses would stop them. And Nixon says, "What is that for?" And he said, "Well, that's in case they make it through." And he says, "Oh my God, Henry, I'm afraid if they make it through, they're going to come for us and kill us." And Chris Hedges says, "That's exactly where we want them. That's exactly where they should be. They should be afraid of people. When Trump isn't doing the bidding of the citizens, he should have to hide in a fucking bunker."
Yeah, he had that moment. He had that Nixon moment when there was civil unrest around the White House. And now look at the White House. You know, when I was a kid, I grew up in Washington, D.C. There was a little black fence around the White House. You could go up there. You could drive right up, jump out of the car, and take a picture of yourself in front of the White House, and then jump back into the car. And now you can't get within blocks of the White House because of the fencing. I mean, even as an individual. So it is changing. I mean, you say so many provocative things, Jimmy. Love talking to you. And I know we go round and around on some issues, but in essence, I think you are telling such truths, and they're uncomfortable. JimmyDoreComedy.com is Jimmy's website. I notice you use the word rapacious a lot. That means greedy, right? I didn't really remember what rapacious is. Greedy, right?
I always thought rapacious meant more than just greedy, but greedy and with a
with the depravity. Absolutely right. Greediness that's on a depraved level. Yeah, that's right. But it's funny. You swing it around like a gunslinger. I love that. You're articulate. You're funny. You're handsome. You're everything I want to come back and be. Yeah.
The crazy thing is, Mark, is that I'm a comedian. I didn't go to Ivy League schools. I'm not smarter than anybody. That's the whole point of my show, is that if a guy like me, a dumb guy like me, can see through this, that means that they see through it. When I turn on the MSNBC and CNN, they see through it, but they're not telling you. They're not going to critique the system ever, and they're only going to tell you as much truth as they're allowed to. And it turns out they're not allowed to tell you much. They weren't even allowed to cover Bernie Sanders in 2016 at MSNBC. What does that tell you? So it falls on people like me, and that's how bad it would. If stopping wars falls on the shoulders of Tucker Carlson and me, we are fucked.
Jimmy, please come visit again.
Thank you for having me.
I love talking to you. Jimmy Dore! Yeah. That's fire-breathing truth-telling from Jimmy Dore. Thanks for, again, all the ways you support us. If you want to reach us, it's edgewithmarkthompson@gmail.com. And until next time, bye-bye.
Subscribe to The Edge on iTunes or on Stitcher, or go to our website, edge-show.com.
Edge-show.com. Stupid. Why is there a dash? Edge-show.com.